Thanks very much, Colin, and I'm really privileged to be part of this tremendous event and tremendous initiative. I'd also like to start by acknowledging the Whadjuk Noongar as a traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on today and pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So my brief was to look to explore some of the connections between poverty and other markers of vulnerabilities, particularly amongst families with children and young people. And in doing so, I was also very keen to explore, I think, one of the particular issues that Colin raised, and a particular point that Donna raised too about poverty getting under your skin. So I wanted to try and uncover from data whether or not there is a legacy in young adult life for people who have been brought up in families in poverty. And that will come towards the end of my presentation. But despite working on it till late last night, I'm quite excited by the results, not in terms of what it says, but excited by the evidence that it's looking to bring to this as a question. So Bob Hawke committed a good 30 years ago to eradicate child poverty by 1990. It hasn't happened. It's a very ambitious and bold statement, and similar statements have been made by prime ministers and premiers around the world. It's a challenging target, but certainly expresses at least a strong statement of intent in promoting improved financial security, reducing vulnerabilities, improving life outcomes amongst children and young people. So I wanted to look a little bit at the data historically to explore how far we've travelled in relation to child poverty and what remains to be done in order to get closer to Bob Hawke's vision. So over the course of this presentation, I'm seeking to just touch on the statistics on the incidence and depth of poverty amongst children and young people, taking my lead from the early slides that Donna showed in her presentation. Be looking at some of the prevalence of markers of poverty and vulnerability and who's at greatest risk, and especially various domains of vulnerability, not nearly in as sophisticated a way as Steve, but just allowing the data to speak to us in which sort of groups or domains of vulnerability we see most sort of collections in. And then I'll move to the final part of the presentation, which is looking at whether or not there is a scarring effect of financial vulnerabilities in the family home on future life outcomes. So just to start with income poverty, and we'll get fairly quickly through this. So income poverty, sure, it's a very narrow measure. It's one of a host, a multiplicity of measures of financial and other forms of vulnerability, but it's a useful jumping off point and often a metric that's used as a marker of success. Now, poverty is a bit like freedom. It's a question of degree. And often you find poverty discussed in very binary terms, but it's not like that. There are depths of poverty. There are depths of poverty both in relation to the degree of financial hardship at any one point in time, and also the degree of persistence of poverty over time. It's a very, very different story to be transitorily in poverty over a year or 2 years versus literally being in poverty for year after year in an entrenched situation with no real sense of resolution to that circumstance. And that's got to eat away at one's resilience and as we'll see at the end of this presentation, persistence in poverty does have a significant impact on health outcomes. So what we've done in a lot of our analysis is just look to decompose poverty at different levels. The standard measure of poverty is one that looks at the share of households below and people below half what's called median income. That's the income of a typical person halfway up the income distribution. We're also quite keen to explore more severe poverty measures, and we take that poverty measure to be 30% of median income. Now, of course, in all income measures, one needs to standardise for household size, which is what we do in our analyses. So then when you look at poverty in terms of numbers, we get, in our own analysis, broadly speaking, the similar figures to ACOS. In terms of the number of households in poverty, around 1.25 million nationally in standard poverty, 2.5 million people in poverty, and just under 730,000 children in poverty in Australia on 2015 measures according to these data. I'm quite keen to look at the depths of poverty and explore the counts and circumstances of those whose incomes fall below 30% of median. And there we see, again, a prevalence of poverty, around just under 500,000 households, 830,000 individuals, and 180,000 children living in households in severe poverty. The patterns of prevalence of both standard and severe poverty shown here. The orange bars are standard poverty, the red bars are severe poverty. And you can see that there's been modest growth in poverty, of course partly due to population growth, but there was a decline in poverty just in advance of the global financial crisis in terms of numbers in standard poverty, a slight growth thereafter, and really we've been hovering at around about the 730,000 mark in terms of children in poverty on standard measures. The thing that worries me is the persistence of the red bars. These are the number of children in households who are facing severe poverty. And you can see that, again, whilst there was growth just at and beyond the global financial crisis, whilst we've settled down a little bit, we're still there at a very immovable group of the child population that are suffering these severe financial circumstances. Poverty and severe poverty is far more prevalent amongst single-parent households. The red bars here represent the counts of single parents in WA who are in severe poverty, compared with the yellow bars for a different demographic group. So basically, single parenthood is in and of itself a very strong factor that drives your situation, your financial situation, and the situation of being in severe poverty. So children in single parents therefore face a higher risk of poverty. They're more likely to experience other forms of financial hardships and material deprivations. We find nearly 1 in 3 children in single parent households are in poverty and 1 in 7 in severe poverty. And just to see what that translates to, we're talking here, once one has taken account of housing costs of an income of no more than $270 per week in income for all necessities and all expenditure, once housing costs are taken into account for single parents. Single parents and indeed single people, whether or not non-elderly or elderly, face a relatively high risk of poverty. These bars represent the over or under-representation of the different groups in poverty compared with their population share. And you can see here that for both single parents and single childless people, there's twice the risk of being in poverty compared with population share relative to other demographic groups in the population in Australia. So again, it's an important signal that we need to take account of. And it's also the case that single parents are far more likely to be in poverty for longer. There are in Australia 250,000 single parent families who have been in poverty for at least 5 of the last 10 years. It's also the case that poverty rates are far more prevalent amongst those in rental accommodation, twice the rate for mortgage holders and 3 times the rate for those who are in mortgage-free accommodation. So single parents in rental accommodation and indeed single elderly men and women also face similarly adverse circumstances when it comes to a persistent state of poverty. There are some issues for us that relate to Western Australia in particular. The typical disposable incomes in Western Australia are higher than in most other states and territories. But of course, with higher disposable incomes, that puts an upward pressure on prices and cost of living. And therefore, in many areas and for many commodities and expenditure groups, prices and cost of living are far higher in WA than in other state jurisdictions. Now, the big challenge is that government payments, welfare payments, are typically indexed to national CPI. And because of that, the real value of incomes for those on government payments or government pensions in WA is lower than the value of those equivalent payments in the rest of Australia. And so even without any other contributing factors, the mere fact of being on government benefits puts you at a higher risk of facing severe cost of living pressures if you live in WA compared with living in other state jurisdictions. And I think that's something which is a real takeaway for policymakers both at state and national level. And just to demonstrate the prevalence of poverty for those on welfare payments, these two schedules show poverty rates for single-parent households in red and couples with children in yellow. And you can again see that the rates of poverty are really high. Around 3/4 of single parents on government payments can be measured to be in significant financial distress and financial hardship. As I mentioned at the start, income poverty is for sure a fairly narrow measure, and there are lots of other measures of hardship, vulnerability, deprivation, exclusion. What I want to try and craft is a link between the two. This was motivated by some comments by Alan Tudge, who recently challenged the role of welfare payments in reducing poverty, and indeed challenged the notion of income poverty in and of itself as a valid metric through which to measure hardship. So I'm posing a question here about whether or not there exists a link between poverty and vulnerability or hardship measures, measures that relate to exclusion and emotional insecurity, and also measures that relate to economic outcomes. And particularly I pose the question whether or not there exists a scarring effect whereby those who are exposed to poverty and persistent poverty in childhood and adolescenthood, whether or not that in and of itself exposes those children and young people to lower life outcomes later on in life, even taking account of levels of educational achievement and opportunity. So just to start with, collecting together the sorts of markers of vulnerability that we have at our disposal in analysing patterns over time and patterns across demographic groups in Australia and in WA. These are a collection of markers of vulnerability recorded in one of the most important sample surveys, population surveys in Australia, the Household Income and Labour Dynamics in Australia survey, or HILDA. It's a longitudinal data set, which is something I'm going to take advantage of in a moment, which means that we therefore record ideally the same individuals and households over time repeatedly. HILDA has released its 16th wave. It started in 2000. So that's built up a bank, a history of up to 16 years of observations on groups of households, which give us a very rich source of information through which to explore some of these intertemporal patterns of hardship. But of course here there are a raft of markers of vulnerability, and one of the questions I was posing myself is, in looking at these data, is to provide some sort of organising framework. And of course Steve and Donna are far more expert in these sorts of areas than I, and I, in a very naive sense, actually just thought I'd try and allow the data to speak to the various clusters or domains of vulnerability on the basis of these individual markers. And so I threw each of the variables on this page at a technique that probably only 3 people in the audience are really interested in, and that's principal components analysis. But really, for those who are not interested or will get bored very quickly, simply to say a principal component analysis or principal component rotation effectively seeks to construct a combined index that relates to often a sort of dimension of sort of social capital, by combining each of these measures in a certain way. And so principal components essentially attaches loadings in at least 2 dimensions to each of these individual markers. And so I did, in a very naive sense, throw these data at the principal components method and found something really interesting. That when you do so, don't worry about the vertical and horizontal axes, simply focus on the clusters. Collected together here are a group of individual markers of vulnerability, which probably collectively you characterize as markers of emotional vulnerability and social exclusion. Markers such as feelings of lack of safety, being unhappy at home, having no visitors, feeling lonely, having no social life. And you can see how these individual the loadings on these individual markers co-locate. So there's a very, very strong indication that this group of markers collectively can speak to this idea of emotional vulnerability. There's another very strong and clearly very related set of markers over here, which relates to financial vulnerability and deprivation. Markers such as you not being able to pay the bills or raise cash in an emergency, not being able to heat one's home. A range of indicators there, again, collected into quite a tight domain. And then over here we have just a couple of markers, but it's interesting that they've been separated out just through this very, purely statistical process as identifying a domain of vulnerability that relates to housing insecurity. And I think, without any sort of deep dive into the sort of theory of vulnerabilities, this is a very empirical exercise, really does flag, I think, some quite useful organizing frameworks for individual markers of vulnerability. And how have these traveled over time and across demographic groups? So I'm first going to look at the collection of markers of financial vulnerability and look at relatively how the prevalence of these different markers of vulnerability vary according to demographic group. One's eye is immediately drawn to the third collection of bars, and these relate to the group of single-parent households in this Hilda sample survey. You can see here that, in particular, not being able to raise cash in an emergency, not being able to pay bills, and a need for financial help are far stronger in prevalence amongst the single-parent group, and therefore the children of single-parent households, than for pretty much any other demographic group in the Australian population. The most prevalent factor here is one's incapacity to raise cash in an emergency, but it did strike me that the not being able to afford housing and not being able to pay bills really speaks to those domains of housing insecurity and financial vulnerability. And the fact that we have the prevalence much higher amongst families with children, I think, is a real cause for alarm. And then when you look at how these markers of financial vulnerability have traveled over time, this represents a plot of the prevalence overall amongst households in a poor financial situation, those households who are formally designated to be in poverty, how the prevalence of poverty, of different markers of financial vulnerability has traveled over time. So you can see here that after a bump in around 2003-04, things were traveling in the right direction in terms of financial vulnerability up to the point of the global financial crisis in 2008-09. Thereafter, you could see that a number of these schedules have risen gradually. So, for example, around 35% of households are unable to raise cash in an emergency if they are designated to be in a situation of poverty. And that's a schedule that has been consistently rising since the global financial crisis. If you look at the markers relating to not being able to pay bills, which is in red, and asking financial help, which is in the mid-blue, again, there was a dip just before the GFC, a growth thereafter, and then there's been a plateau. There hasn't been very much movement there in the prevalence of these markers of financial hardship and vulnerability. These are results that concern me a little when I first saw them. So looking at that other principal domain I showed you in yellow on that cluster diagram, these portray the relative prevalence of markers of emotional vulnerability and exclusion amongst households in poverty. And again, you can see that households with children are the ones that face by far the higher prevalence of some quite troubling markers of vulnerability. If again you have a look at the third cluster, you can see that there are up to a quarter of single parents with relatively low incomes who feel lonely, who have no visitors, who have no social life. As a cluster, that collection of markers of emotional vulnerability is far more concentrated amongst families with a single parent. And therefore, as an experience of living and growing in a household, children living in those circumstances, I think are facing some quite difficult a difficult situation. And so I want to actually explore whether or not these situations perhaps have disadvantaged those children as they're coming into young adulthood and have left the home, which I'll do in a moment. But again, let's have a look at patterns of emotional vulnerability and exclusion over time amongst families in poverty. And again, this was another chart that troubled me. I didn't expect to see, in general terms, that the pattern continues to rise. You can see that there was a dip in advance of the GFC. There was a growth thereafter, but rather than it tailing off, you can see that there are progressively greater shares of individuals on low incomes who do face feelings of loneliness, who have no contact and connections and visitors, and who have no social life. And each of those three schedules, the highest three schedules, you can see have consistently risen over time. So the emotional aspect of vulnerability is something that is not going away and indeed seems to be on the rise. And this, for me, was another really important take-home from this empirical analysis for the purpose of the workshop. And so, on the basis of vulnerabilities, where you can see a very strong and close correlation with financial vulnerability and emotional vulnerability, to what extent does that, in Donna's words, get under the skin? To what extent is that something that you carry with you into later life? So in order to respond to this question in the brief that Colin gave me, what I thought I'd try to do is use the Hilda survey, as I said, a survey that tracks households for up to 16 years of their lives. I wanted to use the Hilda survey to identify young people from the point at which they were dependent children or dependent students within the family home through the point at which they left home, and then look at their future economic outcomes. And one of the tremendous features and advantages of Hilda is, at least for a good share of the survey sample, you do have the capacity to do precisely that. The HILDA survey records specifically questionnaire data for any child 15 or over. And then for a good proportion of those, around 60%, the HILDA questionnaire carries forward and follows those individuals as they leave the home and move into a different phase of life. So what I chose to do here is collect together those observations where a young person was observed for at least 3 years before and at least 3 years after leaving the home. And then, importantly, what I then did was attach to each of those young people a marker of the degree of financial hardship that they faced whilst they were in their family home. And I did so by differentiating households, young people, according to whether or not they had an upbringing in a household which exhibited no apparent financial poverty, from those young people who faced poverty to a certain degree at home, and for those young people who faced a situation of persistent poverty while at home. So then I wanted to explore to what extent the economic paths and life trajectories of young people with these different family circumstances, what paths they followed over their young lives. So this is a chart that compares the employment rates for young people after leaving home between those young people who faced no significant poverty whilst at home in blue, those young people that faced a degree of poverty whilst in the family home in yellow, and in red, young people who were brought up in a circumstance of persistent poverty. And immediately you can see a very, very strong separation, starting out life with essential. So for somebody who has grown up in a household that experienced persistent poverty, there's about half the chance of getting employed at a young age 19, 20, or 21, compared with individuals living in moving away from households with no financial stresses or no significant poverty. And whilst the blue schedule tracks relatively stably over time, you can see that it continues to rise to beyond 80% for young people leaving the home and arriving at age 26 with an 81.2% chance of being in employment. Now, you can see that there's a degree of resilience and recovery amongst the group of young people who left a household that suffered persistent poverty over time. And so the gap to a degree is narrowing, but only relatively later on in young lives at ages of 24 and 25, starting to see the trajectory rise. If you then look at the non-participation rates, of course the converse is true. If you're a young person that experienced childhood and young adolescenthood in a household with persistent poverty, nearly 60% of those young people will not be participating in job search or other forms of engagement at age 19. Again, the trajectory drops over time, but the separation between the group who have faced significant and persistent poverty in childhood versus those that hasn't, the gap between the red and the blue schedules here, again, is significant. There are a number of these analyses that we're going to continue to work on in the sort of narrative that follows this workshop. But here's a final set of schedules that looks at the poverty rate for a young person leaving a home where during the time of childhood and young adolescenthood the household faced significant poverty. And again, you can see that poverty rates beget poverty rates. Poverty rates as a child in the family home appear to beget increased prevalence of poverty in young adulthood. Again, there's a really strong bump over the period of the middle 20s before the gap starts to narrow at age 25, 26 and beyond. Now, of course, when you look at that, you can immediately present a challenge. Is it not the case that the characteristics and circumstances, the observed characteristics of children living up in a home suffering significant poverty, they're just different from the characteristics of the, if you like, the control group of those facing no poverty during childhood? And of course, that's a perfectly valid challenge to which we responded by estimating an econometric model of different economic outcomes for young people, taking full account of the other circumstances that they face and the other achievements that they meet in relation to education, in relation to socioeconomic background, in relation to time, in relation to employment status. So we sought to control as much as we could for variations across the three groups of young people moving out of the home and into young adulthood. And then we then posed a question, having estimated these models econometrically, could you still see that financial vulnerability whilst in the family home has an impact on future economic outcomes? And the answer was yes, we could. So this chart looks to compare for a range of different economic and social outcomes the percentage point difference between young people who were brought up in no poverty versus young people who were previously in poverty and young people who were previously in persistent poverty in the family home. So if I take, for example, the top left panel, relatively, a young person brought up in a household in poverty had a 12.7 percentage point lower chance of employment than a young person that faced no poverty whilst at home. And with no controls, the relative percentage point difference for those in persistent poverty was around 27%, 26.9%. Now, throw every control that you've got at the model and see whether or not their significant effect still survives. And it did. So even controlling for observational differences, effectively matching on all other characteristics of the young people as they move out of the family home, we still found a 15 percentage point lower chance of employment amongst young people who were brought up in a situation where their household faced persistent poverty. The persistence of poverty has quite a strong and dominant effect on a range of these markers, and not just markers that relate to economic outcomes or labour market outcomes. For example, we can see in this analysis that if you as a young person were brought up in a family that faced poverty or severe poverty, looking at the bottom right panel, there was a significantly higher chance of you having emotional challenges. A question in Hilda asked whether or not you consistently feel down or you feel down some or most of the time. And you can see here that there is a significant positive association between the prevalence of feeling down or feeling nervous and your prior situation in the family home. So for me, this is actually quite compelling and strong evidence that poverty does get under the skin. Poverty is something that even amongst children who have equivalent formal achievements or observed achievements in relation to education and labour market outcomes, the experience of persistent poverty in particular is something that stays with the child or the young person for a good part of the rest of their lives. The final chart I'll show you, it continues with that same theme, and it's a chart that we produced possibly a couple of years ago, but for me still is a very powerful chart to demonstrate the association between the persistence of poverty as a financial state and mental health outcomes. So what this chart collects together are groups of individuals who are measured in terms of the degree of psychological stress according to the K10 scale. And not to worry too much about the mechanics of the K10 measure, it simply is an index that relates to a series of responses to questions around vulnerability, emotional distress and the like. The important bars to look at are the third and fourth bars in each of the collections, the blue and the gold bars. These represent the share of each of the groups represented here that are facing, that are marked as having a high or very high measure of psychological distress according to the K10. And then the line that you see is a measure of average K10 score. Now, the various clusters here of bars collect together individuals who have either faced no poverty or progressively have faced 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 or more years of poverty. And so as we move over to the right, that effectively is the direction of travel of increasing poverty persistence. Now, the thing that you can immediately see is that the K10 score rises with the level of persistence of poverty. The longer you are in poverty as a persistent state, the greater the impact that state has had on your level of psychological distress. And in terms of the bars, if you look at the blue and gold bars, you can see that relatively the proportion of individuals who are in high or relatively high or very high levels of psychological distress according to this K10 measure are respectively 19.4% and 13.4% for those who have faced at least 5 years of poverty. That is to say, around a third of households, of individuals, my apologies, a third of individuals who have faced poverty for at least 5 of the last 10 years are also in at least high and possibly very high levels of K10 distress. So that's a really powerful signal to me that poverty has a range of very strong and pernicious impacts, not just in relation to economic outcomes, but in relation to social and health outcomes also. So just to close, in going through these data, it really was a task of trying to paint a picture from the sort of representative data we can access through population surveys, try and paint a picture of the prevalence of poverty and the associations between poverty and economic and social outcomes. We found that to 750,000 Australian children are living in poverty at the moment, and close to 200,000 of those live in severe poverty at below 30% of median standardized income. Single parenthood is a very strong, has a very strong association with child poverty, with 1/3 of children in single-parent households facing in a circumstance of poverty, and 1 in 7 in severe poverty. We've also demonstrated that poverty is a persistent state and one that demonstrably affects health and well-being in an adverse fashion, and especially some of the markers of emotional vulnerability and exclusion, for me, provides a bit of a call to arms to see these trajectories rising over the period since the start of the decade. I think is something that can really lead into a series of economic and social challenges and concerns, and something that we need to address as a matter of urgency. And the final thing that this analysis for me really demonstrated, I feel it's provided some extremely strong evidence, and certainly in my experience and in my analysis, the first time we've been able to provide severe evidence that poverty has a scarring effect on young adults having left a family home that that found itself in financial distress or under financial pressure. That situation in the family home for children and young adolescents carries forward to the young adult as they leave the home, and it affects adversely both economic and social outcomes. And the final call to action is relating to welfare payments, especially given the prevalence of poverty amongst certain demographic groups, particularly single-parent households. It seems to me very much that welfare payments are increasingly inadequate as a protection against poverty, and they have to be part of the story, they have to be part of the solution. Thank you.